Karen had done a lot of crazy things over the years, but this was next level insanity. Welcome to Mike's Stories. Before we begin, smash that like button on the video and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories like this one. It all started when I woke up to the god-awful sound of screeching tires and metal chains clanking right outside my window. Groggily, I dragged myself out of bed, figuring it was just another early garbage pickup day. But when I stumbled outside, my jaw dropped. My car was gone. Not just mine, mind you. Half the street was eerily empty. I spun around just in time to see a monstrous tow truck hooking up my neighbor's sedan. The flashing orange light sliced through the misty morning air like some kind of twisted disco. People were pouring out of their houses in their pajamas, shouting and demanding answers, their faces etched with disbelief and anger. But the tow truck drivers? They didn't even bat an eye. And there she stood, on the sidewalk, a picture of smug satisfaction, Karen. Arms crossed, a clipboard clutched in her hand, watching the absolute chaos unfold as if she'd personally conducted the symphony of automotive abduction. My blood started to boil. I stormed up to her, my voice tight with fury. Karen! What the actual hell is going on? She barely glanced at me, just gave me that infuriation, self-satisfied smirk. Good morning, Mike. Just a little community cleanup initiative. Some of you have been flagrantly violating the new overnight parking restrictions, and we simply can't have that, can we? My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Overnight parking restrictions? That was never a rule. She tilted her head dramatically, tapping her pristine white clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. Oh, but it was passed in an emergency HOA board meeting just last night. We determined that cars parked overnight outside of driveways ruin the neighborhood's aesthetic, so we enforced it. Immediately. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, a furious drumbeat echoing in my ears. Karen, you can't just tow people's cars without any notice. That's illegal. She let out a tinkling laugh, utterly devoid of humor. Actually, it's not. All residents signed an agreement stating they would comply with all HOA regulations, including new ones enacted to maintain community standards. You agreed to this the day you bought your home, remember? I wanted to reach across the invisible line separating us and strangle the self-righteousness right out of her. Across the street, my elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was practically in tears, his frail body shaking as he watched the tow truck drag away his prized possession, a cherry red 1965 classic Mustang, a car he had lovingly restored with his late son. The Garcias next door were frantically calling the towing company, their voices laced with panic as they demanded answers. Where are they taking our cars? Someone yelled, their voice cracking with desperation. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, as if all this drama was a monumental inconvenience to her perfectly planned morning. The company I contracted is taking them to an impound lot 2 towns over. You can retrieve them after paying the necessary fees, which, by the way, have been pre-approved by the HOA. You're extorting people. I snapped, my voice rising with each word. This is theft. She actually laughed, a shrill, condescending sound that grated on my nerves. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Mike. This is simply community enforcement. If people can't follow the rules, they face the consequences. That's when a voice, calm but carrying the weight of authority, cut through the rising tide of anger and disbelief. Where's my car? The street fell deathly silent. Karen's smug smirk faltered, just a hair, as we all turned to see a man in an expensive navy suit standing near the curb, arms folded, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. I'd never seen him before, but something about the way Karen suddenly stiffened, her posture losing its rigid confidence, told me she knew exactly who he was. And you are? Karen asked, trying to regain some semblance of her usual composure, though a tremor of nervousness now laced her voice. The man stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention. I'm David Lawson, the district attorney of this county, he stated, his voice dangerously calm, each word measured and precise. And my car was just towed. Karen blinked. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely nervous. The entire street remained silent, everyone watching with wide eyes as the full weight of the situation seemed to crash down on Karen's face. "Mr. Lawson," she began, forcing a tight, unnatural smile, "I assure you, this is just a standard HOA matter." "A minor?" "I don't think so," he interrupted, smoothly pulling out his phone. "Because what you just did violates multiple state laws." Karen's face drained of color, leaving her looking pale and sickly under the morning light. "You enacted a rule overnight, with no notice, no public record, and no approval from the county. Then, you had a private towing company illegally remove personal property from public access roads." Karen opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "You're looking at civil liability, criminal charges, and a full-scale investigation into how this HOA has been operating," Lawson continued, completely unshaken, his gaze unwavering. "And since my vehicle is county property, you may have just committed a felony." Karen staggered back as if she'd been physically struck. I was just enforcing community standards." "Community standards don't override the law," he snapped, his voice gaining an edge of steel. "And if you think you can just rewrite rules to scam homeowners, you're in for a very rude awakening." Karen's carefully constructed composure was shattering by the second, like a porcelain doll dropped on a concrete floor. The neighborhood, which had lived in fear of her for so long, was starting to smile. A few brave souls even started whispering amongst themselves, while others pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. "So here's what's going to happen," the doc continued, stepping closer to Karen, his eyes boring into hers. "You are going to call the towing company and have every single car returned immediately, at HOA expense. You are going to personally issue a statement admitting fault." Then, his eyes narrowed, sending a visible shiver down Karen's spine. "And then, you're going to prepare for a legal battle." Karen physically trembled, her hands now visibly shaking. I could tell she desperately wanted to argue, to unleash her usual torrent of self-justification, but for the first time in her life, she seemed to realize she had no way out. In one single morning, she had towed the car of the district attorney, committed multiple legal violations, put the entire HOA under a criminal investigation, and utterly destroyed whatever flimsy power she thought she possessed. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The weight of her monumental mistake was finally sinking in, the realization dawning on her face like a slow-motion train wreck. But Karen wasn't about to go down quietly. Instead of accepting even an iota of responsibility, she did what she always did, she doubled down, digging herself into an even deeper hole of her own making. By the time David Lawson finished laying out every single law she had brazenly broken, Karen's face had morphed from smug superiority to barely concealed panic. But rather than admitting defeat, she crossed her arms, attempting to project an air of defiance that now rang hollow. "This is a private community matter," she snapped, her voice still laced with a hint of her former arrogance. "We have every right to enforce our parking policies. If people can't follow the rules, that's not my fault." Lawson didn't even blink. "You can enforce policies, but you can't break state law in the process. And you definitely can't tow government property." Karen waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a pesky fly. "If that's true, then file a complaint with the HOA. I'll make sure it's reviewed properly." I had to physically restrain myself from bursting out laughing. The sheer, unadulterated delusion was astounding. Lawson simply raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You think I need to go through the HOA? Karen, I don't think you understand how serious this is. You illegally towed my car, a county-owned vehicle. That's felony theft." Karen's smirk faltered, the edges crumbling like old plaster. "It was not theft. The car was in violation. The car was parked legally in front of my own house," Lawson cut in, his voice dangerously calm, a low rumble that sent a chill through the air. "And yet, it was towed without warning, without cause, and without the proper legal authorization. That's not enforcement. That's a crime. At that precise moment, Karen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and I saw her face turn completely white, all the remaining color draining away. Without another word, she turned and sprinted towards her house, her heels clicking frantically on the pavement. Lawson and I exchanged a knowing look before following along with half the neighborhood, a curious and increasingly hopeful mob trailing behind her. She shoved open her front door and rushed inside. The rest of us didn't have to wait long to find out what had sent her fleeing. Seconds later, the piercing wail of sirens filled the air. 2 police cruisers, lights flashing ominously, rolled up to Karen's house. Uniformed officers stepped out, their expressions as serious as a heart attack. Karen re-emerged onto her porch, her hands now trembling uncontrollably. What's the meaning of this?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. One of the officers, a stern-faced woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached her, glancing at a document in her hand. "Are you Karen Davis?" She hesitated for a split second, a flicker of defiance still in her eyes. I am. But You're under investigation for illegal towing practices, misuse of public property, and fraudulent impound fees," the officer stated flatly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We need to ask you a few questions." Karen staggered back, her eyes darting around frantically, searching for someone, anyone, to come to her rescue. But for once, no one came to her defense. Instead, the entire neighborhood watched, a silent jury observing the downfall of their tormentor. Karen spent the next hour arguing, lying, and desperately trying to weasel her way out of the situation, only digging herself into an even deeper hole. She vehemently claimed the HOA board had approved everything, but the officers quickly checked, finding absolutely no records of the supposed new parking rule. She insisted she had warned residents ahead of time, but that was also a blatant lie. Not a single warning had been issued. She even tried to pin the blame on the towing company, claiming they had acted on their own accord. But when the officers pulled up the contract from her own emails, her signature was right there, clear as day, authorizing the removals. Lawson watched it all with his arms crossed, a grim satisfaction on his face as he shook his head slowly. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Karen turned on him, her eyes burning with a desperate, furious intensity. "You did this. This is a setup. You set me up." He simply shot back, his voice calm but firm. "All I did was park my car legally and watch you dig your own grave." That's when the final nail in Karen's coffin arrived. Another police cruiser pulled up, and out stepped a man in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase. He adjusted his tie and walked straight up to Karen. "Miss Davis, I'm a representative of the state's Department of Consumer Affairs. We received multiple complaints regarding fraudulent towing and illegal impound practices in this community. We are here to conduct a full investigation." Karen froze, her eyes wide with the dawning horror. The officer beside him nodded in confirmation. "Miss Davis, at this time, we're going to ask you to come down to the station for further questioning." Karen stumbled back, her voice choked with panic. "Wait. This is a misunderstanding. I was just..." "Ma'am, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to take you in by force," the officer stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The entire neighborhood held their breath, a collective gasp hanging in the air. And then, for the first time ever, Karen shut up. She knew she was done. As she was led toward the back of the police car, the whispers in the crowd turned to murmurs, then to outright laughter. People actually cheered. The woman who had terrorized this neighborhood for years was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Lawson let out a small chuckle beside me. "Well, that escalated quickly." I smirked, a feeling of immense relief washing over me. "You're not wrong. You ever think about running for HOA president?" he asked, giving me a wry side glance. I laughed, the tension of the morning finally starting to dissipate. "Oh, absolutely not. Lawson grinned. Smart man. As Karen was loaded into the back seat of the cruiser, her face was red with rage, her eyes blazing with impotent fury. But there was absolutely nothing she could do. The cops drove off, taking her straight to the station. And for the first time in a long, long time, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Karen's arrest should have been the end of it, a satisfying conclusion to a ridiculous ordeal. But as it turned out, she had a whole lot more to answer for than just illegal towing. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the local press had picked up the story. Disgraced HOA president arrested for fraudulent towing scheme. The headline screamed across every local news website, accompanied by unflattering pictures of Karen being led into the police station in handcuffs, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. The story went viral online, and neighbors couldn't stop talking about it. At the local coffee shop, the grocery store, even at the dog park, people were buzzing with the delicious details of Karen's downfall. The HOA board members, the same spineless individuals who had always blindly backed her up, were now scrambling to distance themselves as fast as humanly possible. One of them, a weaselly guy named Todd, even went on record saying, "We had absolutely no idea she was conducting business this way. If we had known, we would have intervened sooner." It was absolute nonsense, of course. Todd had signed off on half of her ridiculous policies, but now that Karen was officially a toxic liability, he and the rest of the board were doing everything they could to make it seem like they had been just as blindsided as the rest of us. But the worst part for Karen? The investigation was far from over. By the next morning, a full audit of the HOA's finances was underway, and let me tell you, the results were shocking. Lawson, being both the victim and the district attorney, wasted no time in filing criminal charges. The fraudulent towing alone carried multiple counts of theft. But the deeper they dug into the HOA's books, the worse it got. Turns out, Karen had been running an entire elaborate scam behind the scenes. She had been systematically charging homeowners extra, completely unnecessary fees that weren't actually required by the HOA bylaws. And where did all that extra money go? Straight into her own personal slush fund. We weren't just talking about a few $100s here and there. Karen had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars over the years, using it to fund lavish vacations, luxury purchases, and extensive home renovations. When investigators finally pulled the receipts, the evidence was damning. Karen's house, which she had always loudly claimed to have paid for entirely out of pocket, had multiple HOA checks traced directly to the expensive renovations. She had been shamelessly using community funds to pay for everything, essentially treating the HOA treasury like her own personal piggy bank. Karen's charges tripled overnight. By the time her arraignment came around, she was facing serious felony charges for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of funds, in addition to her initial towing violations. Her lawyer, a nervous-looking man who clearly knew he had an impossible case on his hands, tried to argue for bail. But given the sheer number and severity of the charges, and the very real possibility of her fleeing the state to avoid prosecution, the judge swiftly denied it. Karen completely lost it in the courtroom. She shrieked at the judge, calling the entire case a witch hunt and hysterically blaming the whole thing on jealous, petty neighbors who simply didn't respect authority. It didn't work. She was promptly sent straight back to jail, where she rightfully belonged. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the fallout from Karen's tyrannical reign continued to unravel. With her finally out of power and behind bars, the remaining board members were left to answer for everything. Todd, the aforementioned spineless board member, resigned immediately, practically tripping over himself in his haste to get out. Two other equally culpable members followed suit shortly thereafter. The remaining members, desperate to avoid any legal trouble themselves, started doing everything they possibly could to appease the long-suffering community. All outstanding HOA fines were immediately suspended. The ridiculous new overnight parking rule was completely and permanently revoked. And all of the illegally towed cars were returned to their rightful owners at the HOA's expense, exactly as Lawson had demanded. Then came the community vote. For the first time in years, the entire neighborhood came together, united by their shared experience, to elect a brand new HOA board, one that actually cared about the residents instead of abusing their positions for personal power and petty vendettas. Karen's entire corrupt regime was officially, and thankfully, over. Months later, her trial finally began. By then, Karen was completely ruined. Her house had been seized by the authorities to pay restitution to the numerous homeowners she had so callously scammed. Her personal bank accounts were frozen solid. She had lost absolutely everything: her reputation, her possessions, and her freedom. The trial itself was a complete disaster for her. The evidence against her was overwhelming, a mountain of irrefutable proof. Every fraudulent check, every shady business deal, every single underhanded scam she had pulled was meticulously exposed in front of a packed courtroom. The jury, clearly disgusted by her blatant disregard for the law and the well-being of her neighbors, took less than 4 hours to deliberate. Karen was found guilty on all counts. The judge, making a clear example out of her to deter any future HOA tyrants, sentenced her to a significant 8 years in prison, 3 for fraud, and 5 for theft and abuse of power. She collapsed in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the verdict was read, but not a single person in that courtroom, not even her own lawyer, offered her a shred of sympathy. And as for the neighborhood, it had never been better. Without Karen around to terrorize homeowners and micromanage every aspect of their lives, people actually enjoyed living there again. Lawson, who had become something of a local legend after the whole ordeal, even helped implement new, much-needed regulations that would prevent the HOA from ever pulling something like this again. One peaceful evening, as I sat on my newly unrestricted front porch, watching my neighbor happily repaint their house whatever color they darn well pleased, Lawson walked by and gave me a friendly nod. "Guess it all worked out," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I grinned, taking a long, satisfying sip of my iced tea. "Yeah. And the best part?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What's that?" I glanced over at Karen's now foreclosed house, its windows boarded up, a faded for sale sign stuck crookedly in the overgrown lawn. "She doesn't get to come back. Ever." Lawson smirked, a genuine, heartfelt expression of satisfaction. Justice served. And for the first time in years, our neighborhood was finally, truly free. Valuable lesson. The valuable lesson we can take away from this story is that no matter how much authority someone thinks they have, the law ultimately prevails. Even in seemingly small community organizations like an HOA, there are legal boundaries that cannot be crossed. Furthermore, treating others with respect and fairness is always the best approach. Karen's arrogance and abuse of power ultimately led to her downfall. What are your thoughts on this story? Have you ever dealt with a Karen in your own neighborhood or community? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories.